Dear brothers and sisters in Christ, be steadfast in the faith which God has gifted to us. Do not be slow to believe, but take to heart what God has revealed to us. Here we are on the third Sunday of Easter. We hear in our gospel from Sunday's readings the road to Emmaus by two of Jesus' disciples, and Jesus appears to them in their midst. And for them, the world seemed turned upside down. There they were following Jesus. Now they just witnessed him crucified and he died. Some women came saying that they went to the tomb and they did not see him there. They did not find his body, but that angels, they had seen a vision of angels who had announced that he was alive. So they're talking about these things. Things are so different. When I think about in our life today, our world in a way can seem turned upside down. Things are so different. But even though the world may seem flipped around, God is not flipped around. God is not turned around. God is there. And just as those two disciples on the road to Emmaus in this encounter helps us to discover more of what Jesus is revealing, how God has been working in our lives, helps us to realize, even in our midst today, God has chosen us to be here in this moment, to respond to him with faith in what he has revealed. And we may find ourselves a little down thinking about those two disciples, Cleopas, as he was explaining to Jesus what they're talking about, and Jesus asked, well, what sort of things? And he says, well, the things that happened to Jesus the Nazarene, a prophet, mighty in deed and word. Notice he did not say that Jesus the Christ or Jesus the Messiah was not believing. And so there was a lack of faith. And so what does Jesus say in response? He says, how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets spoke. The prophets. Jesus is referring to those in the Old Testament. To help us understand, to believe what Jesus has done, we have to understand what the prophets spoke about in the Old Testament, how they foretold of the Messiah, the Christ. And that helps us believe. Remember those two disciples on the road to Emmaus, they heard that Jesus is alive. They recount that vision of angels. They did not see his body in the tomb, but they were still not believing. And so Jesus on that road to Emmaus opens the scriptures to them, explaining to them, beginning with Moses, how Jesus was spoken of, referred to in all the scriptures. How beautiful that is. And sometimes, when we look at scriptures, we can just focus on the New Testament, and that's some good stuff. But sometimes looking at the Old Testament, seeing how God was preparing humanity to receive his Son. And so they were hearing Jesus explain to them what was going on in the scriptures. How God in the Old Testament was speaking in the future through the prophets what would come, so that we may believe, because this can seem quite extraordinary, and something so extraordinary that it's hard to believe. And so God is prepping humanity to receive this good news, this life. And so what happens about those two on the way to Emmaus? As they approached that village, Jesus gave the impression that he was going on farther, but then those two disciples said, stay with us, for the day is almost over. And so he went in to stay with them. Remember, still they did not recognize him. But after Jesus took the bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them, they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. I say, Jesus, why didn't you stay with them? But he did in the Eucharist. Jesus is saying, this is how I am staying with you. Yes, the day is almost over. The second coming will almost be here. But for now, he is staying with us in the Eucharist. Jesus was veiled to them, their eyes prevented from seeing him as they walked with him on the road to Emmaus. Jesus stays with us in the Eucharist, and our eyes are prevented from seeing him. He comes to us under the appearance of bread and wine, but he is still there. And he's asking us to listen to what the prophets foretold. How what Jesus has done is fulfilling the scriptures, fulfilling what God has promised to us. Because God does not forget. God does not abandon us. But he is here seeking to draw us to new life, to draw us to salvation, to life in community with all of his heavenly angels and saints, and with him in that most holy Trinity. And so our days can be challenging. We can fall into sin, wanting to despair, wanting to stop believing. But Jesus is coming to us and asking us to believe, to have faith, and to be steadfast, to recognize him, to recognize what God is doing in your life, and how he is asking you to be a witness to others of what he has done. As those two disciples who went to Emmaus returned to Jerusalem to communicate this good news. They found the 11 who were staying, and they communicated this good news. You might say we're a little bit away from Jerusalem right now, not able to gather as God's people at church Sunday Mass at this moment. But think about, okay, how is God revealing himself to me now? How am I making this journey to Emmaus? And Jesus is being present to me, revealing to me what the prophets foretold of him, what he has done. And so that when I can come back, when I can join in that community again, I can communicate this good news. And how Jesus is with us.